Well, I think there's been kind of an external consensus that the last CBA did benefit management significantly more than the employees. And I think this CBA is something that if it does not restore the prior equilibrium or improve the players' situation, it will be viewed as another loss for the Players Association. So I think from that perspective, you know, there the pressure is more on the Players Association.
Hi, this is Jeff Passan from ESPN, and I want to run you through a little primer about baseball labor relations, and specifically the lockout that we're enduring right now in the sport. It's the first work stoppage in more than a quarter century after Major League Baseball and the Players Association couldn't come to a new collective bargaining agreement. Now, what does this mean? The CBA covers and really governs the entirety of the sport. All of the rules about money and payrolls and draft and really everything that goes over the day-to-day of the sport is contained inside of the collective bargaining agreement. And the Major League Baseball Players Association, which is the union that consists of 1,200 players on 40-man rosters, and Major League Baseball need to come to some sort of a consensus about this document that governs the sport. The problem, of course, this time around is that there's a whole lot of money inside of Major League Baseball, and the owners do not want to give more of it to the players. Now, if we look back historically, the players have really won a lot of these negotiations going back into the 1970s, the 1980s, even the 1990s. But after the 1994 strike that ended in a lost World Series, something changed. Major League Baseball started to understand that pouring more resources into labor relations was something that would pay off long term. And the way that it's paid off is through victories that the league has had in collective bargaining agreements, the most recent back in 2016. Now, that's the one that's at the heart of all of the contention going on here, because the players feel like they ended up taking a bath financially, and, well, they're looking to gain money back that they lost over the last 5 years. Now, if you look at the average salary in Major League Baseball, hey, they get paid extraordinarily well, but the average salary has gone down over the last 4 years, and the players simply want to reverse that trend. They're asking for all sorts of things in these negotiations. They want to get players paid younger in their careers. They want the competitive balance tax threshold, which is the luxury tax, to be higher than the $210 million it was at. They're asking for $245 million, whereas the league is proposing $214 million. And that's the sort of difference that shows the chasm between these two sides and the gap that they've got to bridge before spring training. Now, there's a good chance at this point that spring training is going to, at very least, be postponed, but the hope among everybody involved on both sides, and especially fans, is that these two sides will figure out an agreement before March 31st, when regular season games are supposed to begin. If that doesn't happen, well, we could be looking at a similar situation to 2020, when, remember, in the COVID season, the union and the league went back and forth and back and forth. And in the end, they only played 60 games. Let's hope, all of us as baseball fans, that the 2022 season has a whole lot more than that.
Y nada más y nada menos que con Jeff Passan, a quien le agradezco el gesto de haber hecho nuestro primer editorial, arrancamos nuestro primer episodio de Dúo Deportivo. un nuevo podcast que hemos creado con mi amigo y colega Guillermo Liñares, donde vamos a abordar todo el tema del acontecer deportivo de Venezuela y de todo el mundo. En este primer capítulo hemos invitado al abogado sindicalista Eugene Freedman. Él trabaja para el sindicato de los trabajadores aéreos de los Estados Unidos y nos va a dar una tremenda explicación de lo que está ocurriendo en las grandes ligas entre el sindicato de jugadores y los dueños de equipo. Este conflicto que empezó el 2 de diciembre, cuando los clubes de las grandes ligas impusieron un cierre patronal, ha sido complicado y ya es un problema que va a cumplir dentro de poco 2 meses de haber empezado. En la víspera de este podcast estamos a pocas horas de la segunda reunión desde que empezó el problema en las grandes ligas entre los dueños de equipo y la asociación de jugadores. Eugene nos va a ofrecer un panorama claro de lo que está ocurriendo y su opinión como experto, que alguien que ya tiene 25 años trabajando en contratos colectivos entre diferentes industrias y los empleados de las mismas. Para mí es un placer darle la bienvenida a Eugene y a todos ustedes agradecerles la sintonía en Beatwriter. Sé que nos hemos demorado en retomar este proyecto. Como muchos de ustedes sabrán, me mudé a Colombia el año pasado y la verdad que diferentes ocupaciones me impidieron a estar pendiente de mi canal de YouTube, pero ahorita sí, en el 2022 el propósito es seguir creciendo y espero que ustedes nos apoyen para eso. Por eso los invito a suscribirse y a darle like a este video si les agrada el contenido y a correr la voz para que podamos retomar con toda la fuerza del mundo esta idea que nació ya hace tiempo y que de verdad veníamos con muchísima fuerza en 2020 hasta que tocó tomar la decisión de abandonar nuestro país, Venezuela. Y para mí es un placer darle la bienvenida a nuestro canal de YouTube a Eugene Freedman, a nuestra nueva sección de este podcast, Palco de Prensa.
Thank you, Marcos. My name is Eugene Freedman. I am a labor union attorney. I've worked in the field for over 20 years. Starting when I was in law school, I had clerked for the National Labor Relations Board, which is the government agency that oversees labor relations between companies and unions in the United States. And since then, I've worked for a number of unions, and I've negotiated about 10 collective bargaining agreements, which we call sometimes term agreements, which is for the full period of time, and then thousands of midterm agreements, which are small agreements that are during the course of a collective bargaining agreement.
Eugene, how much do you follow this matter between MLB and the MLBPA?
Yeah, so I follow it very closely. I read all of the articles, and my goal on Twitter is to try to educate both journalists and just members of the public on the intricacies of labor law and collective bargaining.
How difficult are usually this kind of labor problems between an industry and the union? How do you see the situation right now in MLB?
So in recent years, labor activity has been very low in the United States. There aren't a lot of labor actions, whether they be strikes or other activity. It's a very low percentage of the private sector workforce. It's under 10% is unionized. But in the industries where there are unions, there is a lot of activity. There are a lot of public sector unions, particularly teachers and municipal employees. Those are pretty high density. In heavy industry manufacturing, unions are still very strong in automobiles, steel, things like that. And then the building and construction trades in many cities in particular are very strong. My union is the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. We represent air traffic controllers and other aviation safety professionals, and we have a very high membership. In recent years, there have been a few major strikes in the United States, and a strike is when the employees choose not to work in order to put economic pressure on their employer to reach a better agreement. Sometimes it's over working conditions. Sometimes it's over the pay, and there some have been very well publicized, including teachers in West Virginia and several other locations. In baseball situation is a little bit different because all of the employees are members of the union. It's a very strong union, and in this case, the employer, Major League Baseball, has locked out the employees. The players are not on strike. They have not taken a strike vote to authorize a strike, and yet management has decided that it will not allow the employees to work, and consequently, the employers, the separate 30 teams, can't move forward with signing new contracts with players who are free agents or any other activities that normally happen in the off season, such as arbitration over contracts for players who are not yet eligible for free agency, things like that. All of that is on hold, and Major League Baseball has further restricted contact between teams and players who are under their contract. They can't publicize even images of those players. If you look at the Major League Baseball website, it took down all pictures of current players, things like that. That's all related to attempting to put economic pressure on the players so that they will reach an agreement.
In the first place, when Rob Manfred introduced his letter to the fans, he said that this was necessary because the law says that is the step to follow in this case. But then he say another thing in the press conference that he made with the MLB media. And he said that it was a strategy to make some pressure in the MLBPA. Is that necessary to prevent a strike? And if both sides didn't come to an agreement, the players could make a strike to their employees?
So yeah, it was curious, that first letter, because it's not legally required to have a lockout. It's a completely voluntary action. It is unilateral. It is only management that takes that action. The players were not involved at all in that decision, and it's not, there's no timing that requires it to happen. So in this case, it was, Major League Baseball tactically decided that it would put pressure on the players. Now, it's curious because I thought at the time, just before the lockout, there were a lot of player signings, many of them relatively large contracts. And the Mets in particular signed a number of players. At the conclusion of the last collective bargaining agreement, the competitive balance tax expired. So there was no tax in place from the end of the regular season and into that free agent signing period. So it seemed to me that the timing of the lockout was more intended to freeze the 30 owners from signing free agents above the former threshold until they could get a new competitive balance tax threshold in place. It really wasn't, as the commissioner's letter said, to create urgency in the negotiation process. Because as you recall, Major League Baseball walked out of the last negotiation session in December, having said that they didn't accept the Players Association's proposal. They further said, we will not continue to negotiate over a number of matters, including free agency and arbitration. Technically, they couldn't avoid negotiating those matters. They are considered mandatory subjects of bargaining under the law, so they are required. They have a duty to bargain over them. And then they waited over 40 days to make a counter proposal. So if the lockout were intended to create urgency, as the commissioner said, his own side did not act with that urgency. They waited well over a month. It seemed that they took a nice Christmas vacation and then came back with another proposal. So, the tactic, may have been mistimed if it was intended to create urgency. Realistically, the only urgency for either party is the loss of income. And at this point, there's relatively no loss of income. Spring training, should there be games lost in spring training, that would be team lost revenue. It would obviously be locally lost revenue in terms of tax dollars and other things, jobs potentially lost in Florida and Arizona. But it wouldn't affect the players themselves because they only receive their contract salary between the period during the season. So from opening day till the last day of the season is when they receive their salaries. So for the players, obviously, spring training helps them get ready, gets them physically ready to play a full 162 game season plus the playoffs. Obviously, they need it personally and professionally. But that said, there's no economic pressure to be in spring training. For the owners, there is some lost revenue in spring training, but ultimately, opening day is when both parties start to feel some economic pressure. And I think that as that date creeps forward, and the parties get closer to lost spring training time and ultimately pushing back the season, that's when they'll start to feel pressure.
Do you think that the MLBPA will fight this until the end? Or do you think that the pressure will get them and they will need to sign something that the MLB wants because of that pressure?
Well, in historical terms, the owners have always thought that they could break the union. And by break the union, I mean break their solidarity and make it so that the players give in and give in for weaker terms for their contract. That's never been the case. The Major League Baseball Players Association has always had some of the strongest solidarity in the labor movement. They have, obviously a very small, tight-knit group. It's about 1,200 employees, if I recall, 40 times 30, 40-man rosters are all part of the bargaining unit and part of the union, and then 30 teams. So it's a small group. They understand the struggle to make it to the majors, and they know that their time there is limited, that their time to make income is limited. And so they know that if they give things up, both in the short term and the long term, it affects not just them, but it affects everyone who makes it in the future. And they've always been very good about understanding that and sticking together. And, ownership changes as well. The owners that were there in the 70s during a lot of the labor struggles in baseball have all retired and or died. Those who were there in the 80s, for the most part, during the period of collusion, in which management illegally, under the CBA illegally, coordinated to hold down salaries and not sign free agents. Those owners are almost all gone. Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner of the White Sox, who was one of the leaders in developing collusion, is still an owner of the White Sox. He's always been one of the hardline owners. But each generation of owners, as they come in, believe this is the time that we'll get our way and we'll weaken the union. These guys make so much money, they're willing to give it up. They're not willing to give it up. They'd rather take the money and give up some of their rights and give up rights for their future players. And that's never been the case. And probably never before have there been so many players who are making either the minimum or in that 15-player group that is, in the minor leagues, but part of bargaining unit and part of the union. So because so many players are at the bottom of the scale, and that is one of the areas the union is really putting proposals forth on, I think that will be a priority that they're willing to fight for to the end.
Eugene, the MLBPA is a group of 1,200 players, but there are different financial realities between them. There are a group of players that already made millions of dollars during their careers, and maybe they have no urgency that the season starts on time. But there are a lot of 40-man roster players that they still are on the minor. In this kind of negotiation, is the opinion of that group relevant, that they could make some pressure to make the season start on time?
Right, absolutely. And there are players, obviously, in lots of different financial situations. Some of the players may have gotten large signing bonuses either out of the draft or through the international signing, whereas a lot and the vast majority did not get large signing bonuses. They got very little, and like you say, they earn their money through the season, and they need that money. The union does have, and I don't know the details of it, but a pretty significant strike fund that they can provide financial assistance to players during the period that they are missing games. I know that back in 1994 and 1995, the union did provide significant assistance for players so that they could pay their bills in the absence of receiving their salary. So that is an economic support option. Obviously, players like Max Scherzer, who are involved on the executive committee, care about these issues very dearly. They were elected by their peers. And, because of their union solidarity, they're not going to publicize this, but I suspect that a lot of them will provide financial assistance to fellow players who are in need. I know that there were some players who provided financial assistance in 2020 before the season restarted, when a lot of players were suffering financially, particularly those younger players and the players who were on that 40-man roster or just the last player on the 25-man roster. Sometimes they move down and back up again. But yes, the players at the top frequently do support their fellow players. They help them out financially. And that's all done privately. it's not something that unless somebody wants to reveal themselves, they're not going to share that information. But that's one way that the players can help each other stick together during this difficult time.
A lot of people, and including myself, we have the doubt because MLB and the MLBPA, why they are not meeting continuously to try to get an agreement. Is this normal in that kind of process that they took time? You said before that MLB spent for 43 days to make a counter offer. Is that normal, or this is a thing that tell us that this is a very complicated negotiation?
So, I think all labor negotiations have their own unique complications. So I wouldn't say that Major League Baseball's is unique. Whether you're the Teamsters negotiating team for United Parcel Service, UPS, with 340,000 employees, or your My Union with 15,000 air traffic controllers, we all have unique and complicated issues that are very specific to our collective bargaining agreement and the negotiations that are going to be different than any other. So in this case, I think that, the commissioner's statement stating that this was to create urgency revealed itself as false because his own side was not treating it with urgency. The other thing is that I think that the parties are still, to an extent, testing each other, seeing where their resolve is, seeing which issues are priorities. Management may believe that they, can ignore certain issues. They came back without having changed their proposal on the competitive balance tax at all, which I thought was pretty strange because that is one of the major priorities for management in these negotiations. They did not change their playoff proposal as far as I understand, and that too is a major proposal from management. And it may be that they don't seek to change their own proposal yet on those matters, but they also did not make serious proposals on the things that the union was seeking. And I think as the parties start to feel like the hourglass is running out of time, they will get more serious. I know that when my union negotiates, we usually negotiate in blocks of time. We will set aside 2 weeks to get together with management. We'll negotiate with them for those 2 weeks. A lot of that time is done, in our own caucus room, just the union, drafting and developing proposals to make counter proposals or to analyze management's proposals. But we set aside those 2 weeks and we get together every day during those 2 weeks to exchange proposals, to walk the other party through our proposal, to answer questions, to sometimes jointly draft language, to work in small work groups to negotiate language and then bring them to the larger group. There are a lot of different ways the parties can move forward. And then we usually take a week off, perhaps get our team back together just, on our side to develop some counter proposals. And then we get back together with management for another 2-week period. But we do a very consolidated timeline for our bargaining. Other industries do it differently, and it really varies. But I think as it gets closer to spring training, if you don't see the parties getting back together more frequently and for longer duration, I would start to think that they're not going to reach an agreement quickly. And right now, I don't think there's any indication that they will reach an agreement quickly. I would brace myself for a delayed spring training at least. And as they get closer to a potential opening day, again, if they're not meeting 2 or 3 days every week in person, face to face, or at least remotely, like you and I are now, they are not serious about getting a deal quickly. And you never know which party is the delaying party. Major League Baseball generally likes to blame the Players Association for delays. I don't believe there's evidence of that. The Players Association rarely makes statements about the timeline or even their proposals publicly. But I would also, if you do hear Tony Clark make some public statements, I would read them very carefully because he makes them very infrequently. And he usually only makes them when he's very serious or very angry.
Do you think this a thing that Tony Clark could change and he came publicly more frequently? Because when the lockout was implemented by the MLB by MLB owners, MLB Network put the Rob Manfred media press conference like every 30 minutes. Tony Clark didn't appear on MLB Network, which I think it's bad because it's part of the business. But do you think that Tony Clark makes some appearance on public to explain his point of view of this situation? It will be right? It's needed for the industry?
So, my thought is that normally collective bargaining should be done privately between the parties, that the media engages when there is a need, economic need, pressure between the parties, specific news. I think Major League Baseball Network is to a great extent a propaganda arm for Major League Baseball. I think it revealed itself when they did not renew the contract of Ken Rosenthal because he had been critical of some things that Rob Manfred had done, not on Major League Baseball Network, but in his other work, writing for The Athletic. He was suspended for a period of time. That was not made public until his contract wasn't renewed. But then they did not renew him because the commissioner held a personal grudge for basically reporting facts. And, that undermines not just the network itself, but it undermines the credibility of some of the journalists who appear on the network because they may not, if you think about it, they may not be allowed to say certain things while they're appearing on Major League Baseball Network. They can't be as, I guess, objective as they would be for other publications. So I don't think, that they didn't show Tony Clark was a surprise in the least there. But the other piece of it is that Tony Clark is responsible to his members. They vote for him. They decide whether he remains in office. And if they don't like his style or his tactics, they can replace him. That said, I don't see any evidence that there are members who want to replace him. I think that his communications are to the members, and I think that at least the evidence is that the members seem pretty happy with how he and the chief negotiator Bruce Meyer, who he's hired in recent years to take over as chief negotiator, are well received by the members. In certain circumstances, I think it's necessary to make public statements, but I wouldn't necessarily second guess, his style to the extent that Major League Baseball does have a much louder bullhorn, not only with its network, but it's all of the media that surrounds it. The Players Association can do a lot of earned media by getting Tony in front of the camera. That may not be his personal style, and it also just may not be tactically the best thing, because in the war of public opinion, unions aren't necessarily looked at favorably in the United States, and sports unions in particular. A lot of people say they're playing a game. They get paid a lot of money already. Why do they need more? It's sometimes a losing argument just to get into that debate.
A lot of people blame Rob Manfred about everything on this matter, but after all, he's an employee of 30 owners of MLB. What is the role of Rob Manfred on these kind of things?
So he is an employee, but he is also has been for many decades now their lead labor relations attorney. He has the expertise in this area. The owners themselves, I'm sure, are getting a lot of recommendations from him, from his deputy, who's their chief negotiator, Dan Halem, as well as from any outside attorneys and professionals they are working with. And I think that, he is the one making those recommendations. When and how to engage in a lockout, I think that was his recommendation. I think he's, making a lot of the recommendations on the proposals themselves, or at least signing off on them internally before they make the proposals. I don't think that he is, I don't think we should give him any kind of presumption that he is a low-level employee here, without any independent judgment. I think he's deferred to a lot by the owners. I think that he is setting the strategy. I think he is setting the pace, and I know he is setting the public perception here. He controls Major League Baseball Network. He controls the media message. He controls when and if there are leaks on their proposals. He could say to his team, I don't want any more leaks, and there won't be any leaks. He could say, I don't want any owners giving interviews about this, and he has in the past, and they don't do interviews. He is their strategic and tactical leader on this. The fact that he is an employee, I don't think should puts any additional pressure on him or takes away any of his authority as their tactical and strategic leader in the area of labor relations.
Eugene, right now, there is a lot of things that are on the table between the MLB and the MLBPA, like the free agency time, arbitration, the CBT, the playoff expansion, the designated hitter on the National League. There is a lot of subjects that are on the table right now. How common is that between CBA and another CBA, there is a major change like that? Because we are talking that we are trying to make changes, big changes between the 2016 CBA. I think that was the year of the past CBA, and the next CBA. Is that common? Is that possible to change that kind of things between a CBA and another CBA?
So I want to just change the mindset a little bit on this. I don't consider those things to be major changes, to be honest. I think when, and it may have been all the way back in 2012, that the competitive balance tax, it may have been the CBA before that even. It may have been 2008. Yes, it probably was 2008. That the competitive balance tax, then called the luxury tax, was first implemented. And that I think was a major change, because it was something that had not previously existed. Whereas all of the other changes, and even the changes that are being proposed now, are incremental changes. Whether free agency is available after 5 or 6 years, it's still free agency. It's still in its current form. Whether arbitration begins for 20 odd percent of the players after 2 years, or it begins for all players after 2 years. I don't think that is a major change. I think it just changes where exactly the border exists. I think the designated hitter is such a minor issue. Unfortunately, it's a big deal for fans. But I think both parties have interest in the designated hitter, and it's unfortunate and almost shocking that it hasn't been agreed to already, because management does not want pitchers to be injured hitting or running the bases, and the players want the same. And they also want additional higher paid contracts for hitters who don't necessarily have a defensive value. So both sides have a benefit to placing the DH in the National League. Even the threshold for the competitive balance tax, they've had it now for over a decade. It's changed each CBA. And so I think where they place the threshold, and the union has made a proposal on that, rather than the union proposing to eliminate the CBT, which I think would be a radical proposal. But where they place the threshold is just another incremental change. So I think all of these things are relatively small. Usually collective bargaining agreements follow prior agreements with some changes in major areas, but not necessarily major changes. Management's first proposal to eliminate salary arbitration and replace it with a WAR standard calculated value, that would have been a major change. It's also something the union never would have agreed to. So it was not a serious proposal. It was really for media attention, not for something to be agreed to or even negotiated at the table. It was a waste of everybody's time. Once we get those type of proposals off the table, and it seems like many of them are, now you're talking about where you change the guidelines on a lot of the existing things in the CBA. Where do you set the minimum contract? Where do you set the minimum for players on those 40-man rosters, not just the 25-man rosters? Those things are well within the scope of their existing CBA. You're just moving thresholds and amounts, and so I think those are incremental changes. I think they're reasonable, and I think ultimately the parties will resolve their differences over them.
Do you think that the MLBPA will be successful on their petition, or do you think that MLB will stand to maintain the power in the next CBA?
Well, I think there's been kind of an external consensus that the last CBA did benefit management significantly more than the employees. And I think this CBA is something that if it does not restore the prior equilibrium or improve the players' situation, it will be viewed as another loss for the Players Association. So I think from that perspective, you know, the pressure is more on the Players Association. But that said, I think both parties have the same amount of risk. Both parties have the same amount to gain. You know, I think ultimately, whatever the parties agree to is a good agreement because it is something that they've come to voluntarily and jointly. And when you come to a joint agreement, that's when it's best because it allows the parties to move forward and implement it in good faith.
Y así despedimos nuestro primer podcast dúo deportivo aquí en Beatwriter. Espero que en la próxima edición ya podamos compartir con Guillermo y también seguirles trayendo más información y más análisis de lo que acontece en el mundo deportivo de Venezuela y de todo el mundo. Yo soy Marcos Grunfeld, gracias por acompañarnos y nos vemos en la próxima edición. Recuerden que estos podcasts también están disponibles en Spotify y en todas las plataformas de podcast que existen en las redes sociales. Nos pueden buscar allí también como Beatwriter. Gracias y nos vemos en la próxima edición.